Hi everyone, my name is Ramana Reddy. I'm a lawyer from Hyderabad, and today I wanted to talk to you about two things to watch out for when you receive a tax notice from the department. It could be the GST department, the income tax department, the service tax department, central excise department, doesn't matter. If you receive a show cause notice, then these are the two things that you must absolutely watch out for. Now, before we get into that, just to give you some context, let's say, for example, India and Australia are playing a cricket match, and I were to tell you that an Australian player would be doing the umpiring. I mean, obviously, you would say, how can that ever be fair? How can the player for one team be also serve as the umpire? And I mean, this is so obvious when you talk about it in cricket or in the context of a sport. But this is exactly what happens when you receive a show cause notice from a officer of the tax department. So you would imagine. So let's say, for example, that the officer is demanding 5 rupees, 10 rupees from you, and you say, no, no, I'm only liable to pay 5 rupees, not 10. So you would imagine that the officer and you, so both those, these two contesting parties, so you would go before a third person who would be a judge, and that judge would decide whether you are liable to pay 5 rupees or 10 rupees. But unfortunately, that is not the case because the law prescribes a fiction. So it says that the tax officer himself will decide whether I have to pay 5 rupees or 10 rupees, but in a quasi judicial authority, which is in a capacity as a judge and not in his capacity as a tax officer. So it's something like saying the umpire or the Australian player who's doing the umpiring is supposed to do the umpiring in his capacity as an umpire and not in his capacity as an Australian player of the team. Now, obviously, there is a high likelihood of confirmation of demand in this kind of a situation, and it is important to be vigilant about your rights in the process because there is inherent bias in the system. Now, given that there is this bias, what are some of the things that you can do to protect yourself when you receive a tax show cause notice from the department? Now, I'm sure there is something called the 80-20 principle. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of it, but 80-20 principle is basically, it basically states that 20% of the effort will lead towards, will result in 80% of the outcome. And this is not just, this is not just in law, this is everywhere. This is something like, 20% of the people have 80% of the money, 20% of the seeds you sow will result in 80% of the trees tomorrow. So this principle is everywhere. This is called the Pareto Principle. You can look it up. It's an interesting thing. So if you were to apply that principle to responding to a show cause notice, what would be the two things that you would absolutely have to look at before you look at anything else? And I can tell you that regardless of which tax lawyer you go to in the country, these are the first two things that they will look at. I mean, even assuming, just say that you're a law student, it's the first time, you're a newly minted lawyer, your boss hands you a show cause notice and he tells you to examine it. These are the top two things that you should first look at before you go off in a hundred other directions. I'm not trying to say that these are the only two things, but these are the first two things that you would have to look at. And I think they are fairly easy to look at before you go into the nitty-gritties of tax law. So the first one that you would have to look at is something called limitation. So to give you an example, let's say for the year 2000, you receive a notice in the year 2022, which is this year. And you receive a notice saying, look, in the year 2000, you only paid 5 rupees as tax, but actually you should have paid 10 rupees as tax. So I want to collect the balance 5 rupees of tax from you today in 2022. Now, the law does not permit that because the law provides for very strict timelines as to when tax can be collected from assessees or from citizens or from residents of India. And if the department misses the bus, then they really do miss the bus. There's nothing that they can do once they miss the bus to go back and collect tax for previous periods. So that's why you see, on the last day when limitation is to expire, you see a whole spate of notices that are sent out by the department just to make sure that they are within that timeline. I mean, these timelines may look artificial as to why 3 years, why not one day more, one day less. They are artificial, but they give precision as to when can we expect a notice, when can we not expect a notice. So to continue with that same example, let's say, let's take GST for example. So for GST, the limitation is 3 years. For income tax also 3 years, but I think it's above 50 lakhs or so, it's 10 years. If for service tax, for central excise, all 3 years. So let's say for the year, let's say GST was in force in the year 2000, just for the sake of simplicity. If you were issued a notice for the year 1999-2000 until 2003, which is 3 years limitation, then the department is well within its rights to do so. If it issues the notice to you in 2004, 2005, then that is barred by time. So whenever you look at a show cause notice, it is very important to determine what is the assessment year. So in the present case, if the assessment year is 1999 to 2000, so till 2003 they have time. If they are beyond 2003, then they are out. The department basically cannot issue a show cause notice to you, regardless of how great their case is on merits. So the law prescribes strict timelines. I mean, the only exception to this is that the department can claim that you have defrauded the department. You have deliberately suppressed some amounts that were payable to the department, and therefore the department needed more time to investigate into your case to find out that there was fraud played and that there was some under-reporting of turnover or under-reporting of income and so on. Now, in those cases where they're able to establish suppression, which they should say in the show cause notice, they cannot wake up 2 years later and say, no, there was suppression. At the very first stage, they have to plead suppression, and if that is so, then the law gives them 5 years. 5 years to complete their assessment from the relevant assessment year. If they and the law is so strict that even assuming that you did play fraud and they miss the 5-year timeline, if they wake up in the 6th year, even then the law does not allow them to to come after you. So limitation basically is it's a very powerful tool. It's a very powerful thing in your arsenal that you can use and deploy, and it's very simple to understand. So definitely look at limitation before you move on to anything else. The second thing to look at, for the first thing to look at is limitation. The second thing to look at is something called principles of natural justice. So let's say for the year, going back to the same example, for the year 1999 to 2000, you have the department issues a show cause notice to you in the year 2001. So therefore there's no issue of limitation, right? So what next? So what is the next ground of attack that you can mount? So principle of natural justice mostly has to do with principles of fair play. That it is more about the procedure that is adopted. So the procedure in these cases is there's a show cause notice that has to be given to you. So let's say that the officer is saying you have to pay 10 rupees. Then he has to give you show cause saying you paid only 5. Why did you not pay 10? I mean, I have to be heard personally before they confirm the demand. So therefore, otherwise, there may be a valid explanation as to why I paid 5 rupees. And although there is bias in the system, at least the fiction is, that he may agree with the fact that you're only liable to pay 5 rupees. So therefore, there is a whole process that is contemplated, and when there is a violation of that process, that is when this ground comes into play, which is which is principles of natural justice. So again, although this may sound like an empty formality, but it is important that you file your reply. It is important that you file or that you attend your personal hearing and make out a case, because what happens is, even assuming that the assessing officer or the tax officer, he rules against you and you file an appeal, let's say you file an appeal to the tribunal at a later stage, where there's a district judge who is part of the, who's part of the, who's one of the members who's deciding your who's deciding your case. There, the likelihood of bias is low. And you don't want to be in a situation where you go up to the tribunal and the tribunal says, why are you making all these arguments now? Why did you not make all these arguments before the assessing officer? Why did you not make, file all these papers before the tax officer? And now, show sufficient cause as to why you did not file it then and why you want to file it now. And you just don't want to get into all that. So it's better, that you file everything at the, at the first stage. You bring out all your arguments, and you build out a case just at the stage of when you're filing a reply to the show cause notice. Now, I can tell you from experience, and I've seen thousands of cases where this principle, where there's violation of principles of natural justice. Not that I've done all of them myself, but you sit in court, you watch, and there are so many of these that come up. So just to give you some frequent ones, the most common ones. So one is when an order is issued without a show cause notice. So if the officer confirms, he says, okay, 10 rupees you have to pay. And I have not even received a show cause notice as to why I should pay 10 rupees or what is the thinking of the officer to which I can respond to. That is a violation of natural justice, which is basically a violation of fair play. The second case could be, say something like you own an industry and the Department of Industries has issued some report to the tax officer on the basis of which he has confirmed some amount to me and saying that I have to pay 10 rupees. Now, law requires that I be furnished a copy of the report that was given by the Department of Industries to the tax officer so that I know exactly what is the allegation that is leveled against me. Because the tax officer may say, ABCD reasons, but I would like to see the report as to why I'm being held liable. The third one could be bias. Now, we don't see it as much, but but we see it. So let's say, for example, you appear before Mr. X, who is the assessing officer or who is the tax officer. He dismisses your case. You want to file an appeal. And by the time you file an appeal, Mr. X becomes, he's promoted and he becomes the appellate authority. So now we have a funny situation where the same officer is sitting in judgment over his own decision that he passed at the lower level, and that is a clear case of bias. So you can definitely ask for a transfer, or if the officer proceeds to just confirm it or hears the appeal, then you can definitely go to the High Court and say that that's a violation of principles of natural justice. And I think the more frequent one that we see is, if so he issues a show cause notice, you give your reply, but giving reasons as to why the officer's thinking is not right and why you're not liable to pay the extra tax. And he basically doesn't consider your reasons. He just copy pastes your reasons and then he says, therefore, Mr. Ramana Reddy is liable to pay X amount of tax. Now that is a clear-cut case of natural justice. That's a clear-cut case of violation of natural justice, because what is the point of filing a reply if you don't even consider it, if you don't even give any reasons as to why my reasons are not right? So these are, I think, the more, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are the more common ones that we see. So I think, again, just to summarize, there is bias in the system. It is important to keep that in mind. The two things that to look for is limitation. First thing, which is, always look at the assessment year and look at the timelines that the department has. And two, look for violation of principles of natural justice. And look, which is basically procedural fair play, or is there no fair play? And I think these are the two grounds that you can look at whenever you receive a show cause notice. These are the first two things that you can look for. Thank you for watching. I hope that was helpful.